Previously on IBF On Demand.
It's an emotional season finale.
Every time I see him, my heart's racing. I really do picture this future with him.
I've been looking for this type of love for such a long time.
I'm going to cook something up for you. S&OP, IBP, BEP, SNOE, SIOP, whatever acronym you want to go at it.
Tell me where you're at.
I agree. Yes, there will be exceptions.
It's all coming up.
Let's get to it. Welcome. Another edition of IBF On Demand. I'm your repeat, passionate, and still not so humble host, Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. We still have our sponsor came back for this episode as well, Arkiva, your one-plan S&OP software solution. This is a continuing from part one, so hopefully you checked out part one. If you didn't check out part one, pause, go back, watch part one, and watch the whole thing. I know I get these people go to like 6 or 7 minutes and then tune out. You missed the best part, the ending. So you gotta stay there to the ending. So go back, pause this one, go back to the first one, check it out. Check out everything from episode 1 and the essentials for S&OP, what ingredients go into an S&OP process. We're going to talk about 3 or 4 more key ingredients that go into an S&OP process. First of all, I still want to level set ourselves as well. I said, once again, I don't care if we call it a S&OP, IBP, BEP, I don't care what the acronym. Matter of fact, most of those acronyms are created by consultants. And looking at IBF research, there is no correlation really between what you're calling it and how much your success is. We don't see the correlation there. You could have an IBP process, and guess what? I see a lot of people who have S&OPs that are more mature. Conversely, I've seen people who are calling it something entirely different that have a very strong and mature S&OP process that call it something, another acronym they invented inside their organization. So the acronym is not a correlation to how good you do. There's consultants and academia like to put textbook definitions to what they are different, but there's truly no difference. And at the heart of any acronym should be a structured business process that aligns all functional areas to a unified set of assumptions to enable coordinated decision making. If we can do that, I said, I don't care what we call it. I care what we're doing with it. And that's what we need to be doing with it. A structured business process, aligning all functional areas, unified set of assumptions, enable coordinated decision making. Those are the key aspects you're doing. And those become what really the recipe for a successful S&OP process. And that recipe comes with key ingredients. We talked at last one about those key ingredients. Hopefully you've already watched it by now. I've given you the opportunity to go back and pause this and go back. But hopefully you watched that. And a quick reminder for those people who came back from last week, some of the key ingredients we talked about was executive support. The need for executive support. We said most of the time you're doing it backwards. You're trying to force it executive support when you need to give them something meaningful. You need to create that vision for them. You need to create aligning the strategy. You need to enable decision making that they can make. They'll actively be engaged if you give them those aspects. But you need executive support. We talked about the time horizon. The time horizon being more of a planning type horizon, outside of constraints, outside of the extended lead times you have internally that you have to work with when you don't have those constraints, that planning horizon. Generally, most organizations, about 3 to 4 months of when you start. And then it extends about 18-month time horizon at a lot of times because that's going to incorporate your annualized budget cycle generally. So you're looking at 3 to 18 months is your planning horizon. Being in that planning horizon, you're generally looking at more aggregated then as well. So we're talking more aggregation, higher levels of aggregation that you're actually having discussions at. Family. In executive S&OP could be business unit, could be geographies. From a supply, you possibly talking different types of, hourly, that we're working as far as not planning an hourly, but what's as far as how many hours we have as far as work hours, or how many, this work cell total what we have at an aggregated level. The important thing is, I'm saying aggregation is where we're looking at higher levels of aggregation. Being it isn't as detailed as items, locations, and we're talking higher level planning horizons, extended horizons, 3 to 18 months, we're generally talking monthly cycles as well. And that was the other key point I talked about a couple weeks ago as well. A monthly planning horizon. You're talking monthly buckets then as well. We're not getting into the granularity of item, this customer, this item, and really what we missed last month. We're not trying to be reactionary. We're trying to be more proactive, where you can make the differences, where you create buffers, where you create planning decisions. Those things are happening, extended horizon and monthly buckets. And then we talked earlier about those key ingredients that went into the monthly. Product review, demand review, supply review, executive review. If you want to know why I didn't talk about data gathering and pre-S&OP, go back and listen again. Or there's another podcast that talks all about those key elements in a S&OP cycle and why we have those key elements and what those key elements look like. So you want to go back and check out that podcast if you want. But those were really those 4, 5 different things that we talked about last cycle that were really the important ingredients. We're going to pick up where we left off and talk about some other key ingredients as well. One of the things that is commonly mentioned is unconstrained demand. The need to have an unconstrained view of what's going to happen. That trips people up. And that's an ingredient that a lot of companies don't have. They're operating off of shipments that already have some constraint built into it, or they're building into the constraints into this. Now, you will have constraints as an active part of an S&OP process. But the demand side really needs to be what could happen, what we can make happen, an unconstrained view of what demand happened, what the customer would do if we didn't have constraints in place. How do you do this? Number one is because we are talking about that planning horizon that are outside of our day-to-day constraints. They're outside of our lead time constraints. They should be outside of our labor constraints. They should be outside of what are the normal constraints that you deal with day in and day out. The reason we're talking about the extended time horizon is because we no longer should have those constraints. So we shouldn't talk about what we can build, what we can't build. This is what the customer wants. In the supply response, and that's where you're going to bring in, here's constraints that we have. We may need to add extra shifts. We may need to change our inventory policies. We may need to look at these lead times. We may look at these work cells, and we may need capital expenditures. We may need to do this. The we may need tos is the response to an unconstrained demand. But to understand what opportunity you have to start with an unconstrained view within that planning horizons. Now, I get it. It is within some reason. There is some capabilities of your organizations. There is some unnegotiables, okay, that we can't do an infinity amount of products. There is a limit based on what executive strategy, bringing the strategy back into it, that really builds some maybe constraints. But that is really outside of most constraints that we're probably dealing with and you're doing right now. Because what you want is a unbiased, unrealistic, unconstrained view of what the customer wants at that extended time horizon is what you're doing. That builds your unconstrained. The constraint comes in on what the strategy is. The constraint comes in on what the supply response is. And kind of balancing those two, Once again, there's a great podcast on that. Steve Haney, I did not too long ago. It was just a month or so ago. I did actually talk a podcast with him about how do you do an unconstrained versus constraint forecast. Once again, he's a subject matter expert. I'll go to him for advice on this. I did an entire podcast. Go back and check out constraint versus unconstrained demand. Great podcast talk about that. Because the question is going to come up then is, what happens when those constraints lead into, because of port congestion, because of this, because of COVID, how do we bring those constraints in? That's what podcast did. Use some common sense, but ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand your opportunities. That's the picture you're bringing into this. You're trying to create a decision-making forward. You're enabling coordinated decision-making. If I'm going to do decision-making in my S&OP process, if I'm trying to bring in the right information, one of those pieces of right information is, here's what the customer wants if there's any way we can do it. The way to give that view is an unconstrained demand. So my first ingredient for this week's podcast for a successful S&OP, IBP process, whatever you want to call it, is an unconstrained view of what the customer wants. An unconstrained demand is what we're striving for in our S&OP process. That's one of the key ingredients. The other thing that's sometimes equally as controversial, if not more controversial than an unconstrained view, is a one number attitude. And surprisingly, this still gets debate. And I'm really confused about where that debate happens with this. So if you have a different opinion, feel free. Let's have that discussion. Post in the comments. Let me know what your opinion is on not having a one number attitude. And the key is, remember, I didn't say you have a single number, because I get that. You may have slight variations based on what you're doing with it. Because if you have an unconstrained demand, that doesn't become an unconstrained supply. That maybe not exist. But if you have a one number attitude, you're driving to a unified set of assumptions. It's part of the definition we have. You're driving to a unified set of assumptions, so everybody's operating off of the same plan and same assumptions. You can go back to the core numbers of, this is what the customer should want. Here's our supply response to that. That's an alignment. Our finances, we're aligning to that. Once again, the finance numbers can't be the same, because what we report to the street, we may not want happen because we're not putting everything in. Great, I get that. I understand. You may be playing games out there with your street numbers, and finance may be doing this shell game to try to make things look differently. I get that. That happens in business. That doesn't take away from the need for a planning S&OP, planning horizon, what you're doing in S&OP, to have a unified set of assumptions and a one number attitude. If you're reporting something, that's a business decision to report something different. And a business decision is still linked to a unified plan. And you have an idea of, this is what's going to happen. This is what we're going to report. Even if you're doing that, you still know that difference. You can bridge that difference, and you're still making a conscious business decision off of a unified set of assumptions. That's why we have to drive to a single set of plans and a single set of assumptions and a single set attitude towards a one number that we're driving to. Consensus is going to align all functions. We don't have someone going off in the wild, wild west doing their own thing. Everyone's operating off the same plans. So we bring consensus not only towards that plan, but consensus on how to reacting to that plan. We now have the inventory that allows sales to go out and meet their objectives. We now have supply and understand our cost may be increased because we're going to do this, this, and this. And that becomes a financial decision that everyone's aligned to. So it's not just the demand plan. I get it. It should be demand planning driven. Not just because I have this bias to demand planning and I've been in the field for way too long and I represent the Institute of Business Forecasting. I get it. I have a bias, but nonetheless, it really should, that one number attitude should be driven by the demand plan. you should be customer focused. That should drive your numbers. Decisions may be inventory focused. Decision may be financial focused. You may have other strategies outside of that customer. So those are decisions that's made, but it's originally driven, it should be driven by demand plan. But even then, a one number attitude is a one number supply response. It's a one number financial projections that you're making. It's a one number marketing plan. It's a one number product plan. These are unified consensus alignments that you have and consensus responses. One number attitude for an S&OP and your organization helps build accountability as well. If everyone's doing their own thing, no one's really accountable, because then it's easy to finger point. You didn't do such that. You didn't say, but you didn't have such that. It's easy to not have accountability if you have silos and everybody's operating off their own plans. You have no accountability. Driving to a unified set of assumptions, a one number attitude for your organization, a one number attitude for your S&OP process helps build joint accountability. It's a consensus. We're operating off the same assumptions. We agreed on these. Now, everybody is accountable for the same logic and same assumptions going forward. So it actually builds more accountability by driving to these same plans. And it's going to help minimize bias. Not just forecast bias. There's bias in everything you do. There's bias in our plans that we do and bias in our responses to these plans, our interpretation of the plan. There is going to be bias. If we can have a unified set of assumptions, a unified plan, a one number attitude, that consensus that helps minimize the bias that our reaction is going to be and what we think is going to happen. So a one number attitude is a critical component of that. So we have an unconstrained demand and we have a one number attitude. And that's it. I don't know why there's still debate on that. It really is something we should strive to, and it's a key ingredient in a successful, mature S&OP process. The next one I want to talk about is collaboration, communication, and transparency. During the pandemic, IBF did a lot of research weekly, really sending out type of research. We did it through our town halls, interviews, seeing what was different during COVID in an S&OP process. And I already mentioned one of the things we said, almost 50% of the companies started going to some type of weekly process. That was key. So we really started seeing that really execution aspect of it. We also seen that companies started using more data and bringing in different sources of data to try to understand what was going on. We've seen that companies were reacting with smaller changes, but more frequent changes. We've seen as one of the things as well. But one of the key findings we had, if you wanted things that just a generic view that really crossed no matter what industry you're in, no matter how big your organization was, the most successful S&OP processes had these three things in common: were collaboration, communication, and transparency. They really strived for those three things. And guess what? Those are really key ingredients in a successful S&OP process. In the middle of COVID, in the new norm we may have, years from now, I really think it boils down to those three aspects as well: collaboration, communication, transparency. Back to our definition, if we're aligning all functional areas to coordinated decision making, if we're trying to do that, it really becomes important that we're collaborating, we're communicating, and we're being as transparent as possible. I said this really was highlighted because of COVID then as well. When we're talking about collaboration, S&OP is a cross-functional. It's not a supply chain process. It's not a demand planning process. It's a cross-functional process. Aligns all functional areas. If it's a business process, you're most likely impacting all functions then. So you need to align all functions. That becomes your collaboration side of it. That becomes bringing these, marketing, HR, engineering, demand planning, supply, everybody together on the same page, unified set of assumptions, one number attitude, really collaboration becomes the key, though, is bringing everybody together. That becomes a key ingredient, is to really start breaking down those silos and start working collaboratively towards the same objectives and same goals. So collaboration is key. One of the ways you can build better collaboration and everybody understands what's going on the same page, you need to have communication. We always talk about, a lot of surveys when you talk about cultures and organizations that aren't really working efficiently and effectively, it usually boils down to communication as one of the key problems inside that organization. Guess what? It's usually because of siloed mentality. So if we can build collaboration, communication starts working on itself. But even that said, you still need to formalize and work on active communication inside your S&OP process. Make it a key tenet, a key ingredient, an essential of your S&OP process is a standardized communication, open communication, working on communication, cross-functional collaboration. You need to work on that communication as a key aspect as well. And then open and honest communication comes to the transparency side of it. Being as open as transparent as possible. Once again, if you have silos, you're keeping things close to your vest. You're doing things because this is only important to us. I don't want everybody else to benefit from this. If you're working cross-functionally and collaboration, you really want to share and them to share back. That becomes the transparent part. S&OP is successful if you're as transparent as possible, all functions contributing at what they need and what they need out of it, and what they know and what they don't know as well. And that really became the key part during COVID that we saw this become successful, because you were working, there was uncertainty. Let's admit, we don't know what's happening tomorrow with COVID. We don't know what's going to happen next week. So with that uncertainty inside of business, it became important to work together and share what we knew and what we didn't know. That became equally as important in that transparency side. And one of the key aspects when you really grow to a successful, mature S&OP process, when you become that vanguard of an S&OP, that communication, that collaboration, that transparency grows outside of your own four walls. You're bringing individual silos, breaking those down and building collaboration internally. But then when you really start having success and when you bring those externally as well, that's what we found out through COVID was the most successful organizations. The ones that extended their planning, their S&OPs externally to their customers and to their suppliers as well. It became a really end-to-end, extended end-to-end type of S&OP process that brought customers and suppliers in to collaborate with, to communicate with, and be as transparent as possible. Having that conversation with your customers saying, we don't know. What do you know? Let's start working together on what we do know and what we can do together to get through this black swan COVID event that we're occurring. Having communication of this is when we think it's going to happen. These are the disruptions we're seeing. This is what it means to you as a customer. Supplier, I don't know, but guess what? We're not going to be ordering anything for the next 2 months maybe because we're changing some internal policies, but that's because of what's happening. It's long term. Let's work together. How do we get through this? Because I don't want you to shut down when we stop ordering things. What's this mean to you? How do we have this discussion with our suppliers as open and transparent as possible? Open communication, collaboration. That successful S&OP ingredient is not only internally, but it extends beyond your four walls as well. That becomes a successful S&OP. You work with your trading partners, customers, suppliers on a one set of assumptions that you're really driving them. It becomes that one number attitude, becomes that consensus, unconstrained view of what you think is going to happen. Everything we talked about really extends beyond that as well. So that really becomes the key ingredients. So recapping what we had, executive support really starts from what you do to give them value, but you need executive support. We're talking about planning horizons, that extended planning horizons outside of your constraints. 3-4 months extended to 18 months. So 3 to 18 month type planning horizon. Since we're talking about higher levels, we're really talking about really family levels. We're talking about higher levels of aggregation. And we're talking in monthly buckets that include product demand, supply, and executive reviews. Being we are talking about extended planning horizon outside of constraints that we have, let's give that view of what customers want. That was the unconstrained demand view that we want to create. That's the view we want to give of what's potential. And if we're giving that as well, let's everybody align on a single set of assumptions and go to a one number attitude. No longer anywhere from debate. There's no debate on this. It's a one number attitude is a successful S&OP. Debate me if you like, put it in the comments, but it's a one number attitude are the most successful, measurable, most successful S&OP processes. And then last but not least, communication, collaboration, transparency. That becomes the key of any S&OP process. That's what we saw as successful. That's what continues to be successful going forward. That's it. Those are successful not only internally, but extending those externally then as well. Hopefully, you have a better understanding now of those key ingredients, what makes a successful S&OP process. I talked about the essentials. We have an S&OP maturity model. Check it out. Absolutely free. You can go onto ibf.org, do a self-assessment. It looks about 13 different attributes, not just some of the ones we talked about now, but some of the other ones. See how you measure up, not only to your peers and benchmark, but see how you measure up to that best in class. We measure things as far as a emerging, just starting, to the essentials. Everything I talked about are the essentials. Then you get into the next level, and then you get into the best in class vanguards that are really seeing success in an S&OP IBP type process. See how you measure up. Go to ibf.org right now. Check out our free S&OP self-assessment on that page. You can go through it. Takes 15, 20 minutes maybe to go through it. Tells you exactly where you are. I said benchmark compared to everybody else, where your strengths are, where your gaps are, and where you are to the best in class and vanguards, and see if you are a vanguard. And if you are, I'd love to hear from you, because we're looking to do some case studies going forward. So if you're next level of vanguard, reach out to me, eric@ibf.org. eric@ibf.org. Let me know. I'd love to do a case study on you possibly going forward. My name is Eric Wilson. This is ibf.org. Once again, eric@ibf.org. If you have any questions, comments, please like, share, subscribe if you already currently haven't subscribed on a podcast or YouTube channel. We do have a sponsor, Arkiva, your one-plan S&OP software solution. Like I mentioned a couple weeks ago, while you're on that IBF site doing that maturity model, go over to the events page. Check out a live in-person event at ibf.org, Orlando in October. Hope to see you there. And I went through 7 or 8 different principles of the essentials, as I called them, for for S&OP success. I'll give you number 8 now. Number 8, the most important principle of an S&OP when you're meeting back face to face. Don't forget, wash your hands.